What things do you hold as precious? What are your treasures? I remember when I was a kid, I had toys, and you probably had toys when you were a kid, and different ones were I just thought my life would end if I didn't get a certain thing on my birthday or something for Christmas. Because that was back in the day when you had catalogs. Anybody remember catalogs? It's long before internet. You had a Sears and Roebuck catalog, and you get that catalog out, and you knew exactly where the toy section was in the back. And you go to the toy section, and it was all worn out by the time Christmas got there. Because you'd been picking through, and you'd pick something out, and then you'd look at it again. Oh, no, I didn't read that part about that. And, oh, wow. That was cool. And then I got into making models, building model airplanes. I'd go to the store and I'd look at the dime store for hours. It seemed, I don't know if it was really hours, but that was back in the day when you could turn a kid loose downtown and they could go in a store and spend a lot of time and not worry about anything happening to them. And I'd pick out whatever model airplane I wanted to build, and I'd take it home and I'd get the right paints and I'd paint everything and put it together. Man, I was so proud of those things, and I'd hang them from the ceiling. I have no idea where those are now. All the toys I had when I was a kid, they're just gone. I had a Johnny 7. I had a Monkey Division helmet. Anybody, you guys old enough to remember a Monkey Division helmet? That was cool. It had things on the side like it had radios, and had a big wire that stuck out like you had a real antenna. It was all pretend. It had this blue visor that would come down in front of your face. I had some cool stuff when I was a kid. We weren't even rich. You just had that stuff. Everything went around guns and shooting an army, because back then they didn't think that was a bad thing. And I went through Fanner 50s. Anybody remember? I must be really old. But the Fanner 50 was a cool cowboy gun. It was a 6-shooter, and you could get it either single or double holster, and you'd pull it out, and they called it a Fanner 50 because the trigger had a big flat paddle on the end of it, and you pow, 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 and you could put caps in it. Kids don't know what caps are today. It was fun. Those were my treasures, things I held precious, and they're all gone. And those airplanes that I hung from the ceiling and worked on for hours, they're all gone. Because your treasure changes as you mature, and you find out what's really important. And the things that are really important are the things that you want to hold on to. And as I would grow up, I thought, oh, those are things from my childhood. I don't want those anymore. I wish I had them all now, because I was too mature to appreciate the value that they would have later. And so anyway, they're all gone. But in the 13th chapter of Matthew, I don't know how familiar you are with Matthew 13, but if you've ever studied parables, you probably know Matthew 13 as the parable chapter, because Jesus talks about parable after parable after parable concerning the kingdom. And this is what he says when he finishes up with those parables in verse 51. Matthew chapter 13, verse 51. After all these parables, he asked this question, have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. Do you think they did? They evidently thought they did. They said yes. And Jesus said to them, therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings out of his treasure things new and old. What is a scribe? We don't use that word much anymore. It was somebody who wrote, and they wrote professionally. And typically what Jesus would be referring to as a scribe are those who would write down the words of God, the law, the words of the prophets. They would copy these things by hand, of course, because they didn't have any mechanical means of doing that. Printing wouldn't come along for another 1,400 years. A printing press, that is. And so when they wanted something written down, you would hire a professional scribe. And the scribes were the ones who were writing the law all day long. That was their job. And so they knew the law, literally backwards and forwards. There is a Masoretic tradition, and the Masoretes, that sounds like majorettes or something, but they were a sect of the Jews who took it upon themselves to keep the law in its purest form. And they would write down not word by word the law of God, but they would write it down letter by letter. And then they would count those letters, and they would count them frontwards and backwards, and they would make sure that they had everything just right. So these were guys that knew the law. And Jesus says, If you understand all these things, you'll understand it's like a scribe, someone who writes down the law, who is like a householder. I mean, if you're a householder, you probably know what's in your house. And he said you would pull out of your house treasures. What kind of treasures? Two kinds. New treasures and old treasures. It's interesting the way our Bible is divided into New Testament, Old Testament. What we study most of the time is the New Testament, and that's fine because it is the New Testament, after all, of Jesus Christ. It's a covenant that He created and He ratified with His own blood. He purchased that covenant with His blood. But then Jesus talks about old treasures as well. Paul, the apostle that Jesus chose out of due season, as Paul would later put it himself, wrote this in Romans chapter 15. This is Romans 15, the letter that Jesus, Apostle Paul, wrote to the church at Rome. And he says this, and it almost seems like they don't go together until you think about what he's saying. By the way, if you're familiar with chapter 14, 14 was all about considering each other's opinions and not picking on one another based on our opinions about things that don't really count. Let everybody have their own opinion about things where God has not dictated. That's what he says in chapter 14, essentially. Then he starts out what we call chapter 15 this way. We who are strong, we ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not just please ourselves. And you can see how that would make sense with regard to opinions. Somebody expresses an opinion, and we're so mature, we know their opinion, oh, that's a pretty stupid opinion, that's just kind of dumb, it's immature. But you're not going to talk like that. You're not going to act like that. You're not going to behave like that towards them. Because the teaching of Jesus through his apostle here says, bear with the weaknesses of those who aren't as mature as you. That's essentially what he's saying. Each of us is to please his neighbor for his good. Not for our good, but for his good, and not just please ourselves. For his edification. Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. Now when he says, as it is written, where is it written that he said that? That's the Old Testament. That's not New Testament, that's Old Testament. And so he then says in verse 4, for whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Can you see how that fits together? How many years of history does the Old Covenant cover? When we read beginning in Genesis and we go up through Malachi, the final prophet, about 400 years before Christ, talking about 4,000 years of human history, God's history, the record that he wanted us to have. And when we look at that record, we're seeing how God worked with his people, in his people, through his people, and sometimes, sadly, in spite of his people, to bring about good for everyone. And so Paul is writing to the church, and he says, people are going to have opinions, and you're going to think some of them are silly, but you bear with those weak ones. And here's why. The reproaches, he says, quoting Jesus, as Jesus quoted the Old Covenant, fell on him, and he says that was written in earlier times. And all the things that are written in earlier times are written for our instruction so that we, through perseverance, might have hope. We can look back at that 4,000 years of history and see how they persevered. God persevered, and his people persevered. The faithful persevered. They kept going. What was that movie with Clint Eastwood? Was it Pale Rider? No, it was Outlaw Josie Wales, I think. All you Clint Eastwood aficionados out there will remember this movie quote from his Indian friend. He said he went to see the president, and the president told him, endeavor to persevere. And I thought that was a cool statement, cool quote, and I can imagine a president telling somebody that. But that's what Paul is saying here. We read the Old Testament, and it teaches us to endeavor to persevere, to keep on going through patience and the comfort of the Scriptures. We might have hope. Hope. We can look back and say, they made it. I could make it. They did okay even though they were sinful and weak and silly sometimes, just like me. So if they did okay and God accepted them and God was pleased with them in the final analysis, then He'll accept me and He'll be pleased with me in the final analysis. That's the kind of thing that Paul is talking about, I believe, that we can look at when we go to the Old Scriptures. So talking about old treasures, what I want us to do in the remainder of the time we've got is go back into the Old Covenant and look at just a few of the things that, to me anyway, are treasures, things that we can hold on to, that we will know aren't like those toys and those model airplanes that we'll just get rid of. These are things we'll want to hang on to. Well, the first one, Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. By the way, I was listening as Alan was wording the prayer. You didn't know people did that, did you, Alan? People listen to prayers. 3 things he said, if I got them all down right. He was talking about tonight's lesson, and he said, Lord, help this lesson, help us against the struggles against the world. Yeah, that's what I want this lesson to do. Help this lesson to increase our faith. Yes, that's what I want for this lesson. And I think the last one, I wasn't really clear on this, help this lesson to help us in our day-to-day lives. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what you said. You may not even remember what you said, but that's exactly what I want this lesson to do, to help us in our struggles in this world, to increase our faith and help us in our daily walk. And there it is again. Can anybody else hear that sound? You did? Oh, okay. So I'm not crazy. There really is sound like a sucking monster behind me. A big tentacle's going to come up out of there and grab me. It's the baptistry. It's all right. It's no big deal. I think it's got a slow leak somewhere. Anyway, chapter 50 of Genesis. This is the end, so to speak, of Joseph's story. You know what happened to Joseph? He was the second to the youngest of all the children of Israel, and his brothers hated him because his father loved him more than they thought they did. So they sold him into slavery. Everything seemed to be going wrong for him, and then he got down in there and Potiphar bought him, and everything was going great. It seemed like, man, this was turning out pretty good, being sold into slavery. He came to be a great man in Potiphar's house, and then Potiphar's wife took a liking to him and lied about him because he wouldn't mess around with her, and so he was thrown into prison as a potential sex offender. But while he was in prison, God gave him favor in the eyes of the jailer. So hey, even in jail, God was blessing him, and it wasn't turning out too bad. And then he interpreted some dreams, and through the interpretation of those dreams, by the way, this is years. This is taking years for all of this to take place. So he's waiting for years, but finally, his faithfulness brought him before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh made him second in command of all Egypt. And now his brothers, who have sold him into slavery years and years prior to this, have come down into Egypt, and they have been saved in the famine because of Joseph's work with the crops of Egypt. It's a long story. If you didn't catch all of it, just go back about 15 chapters and start reading up to this point. Don't do that right now. But anyway, their father died. Jacob died. And these boys that had sold Joseph into slavery thought, oh man, it's over for us now. Our father's dead. And so Joseph is going to take his vengeance on us. But Joseph said this to him in chapter 50 of Genesis, verse 19. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Now there's a godly attitude and a godly spirit and an accurate godly assessment of how things were in his life. To me, this is a jewel. This is a treasure, because I can see that even when things seemingly don't go well in my life, it may well be that God is working with me to bring me to a point where he can bless me even in spite of bad things that are happening to me. It might be bad things regarding my health, my finances. It might be that people have done evil to me. It might be that I've been treated unfairly. Whatever it might be, and all these things have happened to us, give space for God to work. Keep faith like Joseph did. Stay faithful. When you read his his life as a young man. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. But he kept the faith. And God blessed him through all of that. And all of the bad things, as he says here, turned out for his good. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that's exactly how God caused it to turn out in his life. You remember Romans 8:28? All things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. God can do that for us, and he did it for Joseph, and he'll do it for us. Well, there's one jewel that I want us to hold on to. The next jewel is in Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. Those judges are some pretty colorful characters. But perhaps one of the, I don't want to sound ugly, but perhaps one of the least colorful was Gideon. Because he was found at the beginning of this account hiding from the Midianites. The Midianites had swarmed all over Israel because they had done evil in the sight of God. So he allowed their enemies to come in. And since there were so many Midianites, they were taking all the crops, taking all the cattle, all the donkeys, everything they had was being taken by the Midianites. And so Gideon is threshing wheat in hiding. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat under an oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, and the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, by the way, this is Judges 6, starting at verse 11. I think I told you that, I'm not sure. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. By the way, there's nothing so far that would tell us that Gideon was a valiant warrior. Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. Was all that true? God had not abandoned them, but he had let Midian come in. From Gideon's perspective, that's what he thought was going on, and so he's simply expressing what he thinks is the truth at this point. And the Lord looked at him in verse 14, it says, go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? And he said to him, Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I'm the youngest in my father's house. But the Lord said to him, surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, if now I found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out of my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. What's Gideon doing? He's questioning. He's asking questions. But it's not the kind of questions that are snide, negative, demeaning questions. He's asking questions because he's not sure about something that he seems that he wants to be sure about. I think he wants to believe what's going on. These are not disrespectful questions. But these are the kind of questions you ask when I'm really not sure. But he's leaning and he's moving in the direction of taking to heart what the angel of God is telling you. And so he says to the angel, wait here until I bring back an offering, because I need you to show me a sign. Well, it says, Gideon went in and he prepared a young goat, and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour, and he put the meat in a basket and broth in a pot, and he brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. The angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread. And what happened? Fire sprang out from the rock, and it consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Can you imagine being Gideon at that point? You're threshing wheat because you're scared of the Midianites. You're trying to hide your food from them. And the angel shows up and says, hey, you're going to deliver Israel. What, me? You remember Moses when God came to him in the burning bush? He said, you're going to go down and get my people out of Egypt. And he said, oh, I'm not your man. That's kind of what Gideon's doing here. I've never done anything like this. I've always agreed with God. You know, he wanted me to do stuff. I'm your man, Lord. Right. You too, probably. So he sees what happens when the angel puts his staff to this meat and the fire comes out and consumes it, and then poof, the angel's gone. So he's scared. Lord says to him in verse 23, peace, do not fear, you shall not die. And so Gideon built an altar, and he named the place the Lord is peace. And it's still there. It was still there at the writing of Judges. I don't know that it's still there right now, but it was there then. They get a little farther on down in the text, and some things happen, but I want you to pick up with me at verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you'll deliver Israel through me as you've spoken, behold, I'll put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken. These people lived outdoors. They were experienced with the way dew worked. And they knew if you left something outside and the dew came, that it would be wet as well as the ground would be wet. But he's asking, I'm going to put this fleece out, this skin of a sheep or a goat, and I want you to make the fleece wet and make the ground around it dry. So when he rose early the next morning, verse 38, and he squeezed the fleece, he drained out from the fleece a bowl full of water. Gideon said to God, don't let your anger burn against me that I may speak once more. How do you normally imagine people in the Bible talking? Sometimes I read, and in my mind I'm thinking, do not let your anger burn against me that I may speak once more. But I'm thinking that Gideon, he's probably saying, please, just let me make the test once more with the fleece. Kind of a voice like that. I don't know, I wasn't there. Bible doesn't say specifically about that. But I think I know what I would be like. He says, let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. The opposite of what he had asked the night before. God did so that night. For it was dry only on the fleece, and the dew was on all the ground. So Gideon now knows God's with him. He's selected the sign. God didn't tell him what sign to make. Gideon did that. And he's asking questions, and he's asking for signs because he's not sure about how these things are going to go. One thing we did not read, but the Midianites had been there for 7 years. 7 years. So he's had 7 years to live in this kind of a situation and to think that things are negative and down the tubes and God's abandoned them. But when God comes and says, this is what I want you to do, he says, well, okay, but I need a little extra reassurance. Do you ever need a little extra reassurance? I do. And I don't think God minds if we ask him for it. It seemed to me that Gideon was always moving in the direction of God. He was just moving a little hesitantly. But there was always faith there, it seemed. He didn't dismiss the angel. He said, wait here until I bring you an offering and you can show me a sign. And that's what the angel did. And based on that, he proceeded a little farther. Okay, if you want me to do this, Lord, I'm going to put this fleece out. Will you make the fleece wet and the ground dry? Okay. God does it. Okay, well, one more thing, Lord. Let me put that fleece out tonight just to make sure this isn't some kind of fluke. I don't know what he was thinking, but he says, make the fleece dry and the ground wet. And that's what he got. You ever struggle with your faith? Now, maybe not your whole faith, but maybe there's one aspect of it that you're being challenged in. Maybe it's just one person. And you're having a real hard time relating to that one person, and you're thinking, I can't do this. And God is saying, oh, yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. Whatever it is that you're struggling with, keep praying. Keep asking God to help you. When I read Gideon, I'm encouraged. Because from the very outset, the angel said, you're a valiant warrior. And I believe, God sees us a lot differently than we see ourselves often. I know I'm small, but God does great things with small people. That's what the Bible's full of. It's full of God doing great things with small people. I'll remind you again, he made a donkey talk, and he set a prophet straight with a talking donkey. Now, if he can do that with a talking donkey, what can he do with me and you? I think there's another jewel right there. I'll just throw that one in for free. That's not even in my notes. I'm not throwing it in. God threw it in. Well, you probably know the rest of the story of Gideon. With 300 guys who didn't even have swords or spears, all they had was torches at night and pitchers over those torches so the fire and the light wouldn't show. And they took trumpets. There were 300 of them, and they divided up into 3 groups of 100. They snuck in around the Midianite camp at night, and they blew the trumpets in the middle of the night, and they broke the pitchers so that the light from the torches would shine through. The Midianites came out of their tents, It was dark in the camp, and they saw all those torches and heard the trumpets, and they thought they were being overrun by the enemy, and they started fighting whoever was next to them, and they wound up wiping each other out. The Midianites killed themselves. And so Israel was delivered. Who could have seen that coming? Well, God. God sees all that stuff coming. This is treasure. This is fantastic. You can't make this stuff up. 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. We're reading here about a fellow by the name of Naaman. And he's got leprosy. And he winds up going down to Israel to see the prophet Elisha because he's been told by a little servant girl. A little servant girl said there's a prophet in Israel that can cure your leprosy. And so he winds up going down there. This is Naaman. He's the captain of the Syrian army. And he's got his big entourage, and they ride down there together in their chariots and with all their finery, I'm sure, and all the pomp and circumstance that would come with the captain of the Syrian army. Comes up to Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even come out. He sends his servant out. He says, go tell Naaman to go down to the Jordan River and dip 7 times, and he'll be clean. And what did Naaman say? He said, I'm mad. He wanted some big thing to happen. He didn't think that was the way it ought to be done. He said, all the rivers back in Damascus are better than this little muddy Jordan River. But his servants talk to him and they say, listen, just do what he said. Go down to the river, dip 7 times, and you'll be clean. And guess what he did? He went down to the river, dipped 7 times, and he came up clean. It's pretty simple, isn't it? When God says this is the way it's going to work, then that's the way it's going to work. And you can take his word on it. And I read this and I think, wow, how simple. How silly, however, it must have seemed to Naaman, based on what he says in the text. Go down to the Jordan River and dip 7 times. That just doesn't make any sense at all. Did the water of the Jordan cure his leprosy? It did not. If it had, all the lepers in the world would have been going down to the Jordan River and dipping 7 times. But that was only for Naaman. Because it was God who cured his leprosy. And it's really the same thing with baptism. It's like a perfect parallel. Because baptism seems silly to a lot of people, that your salvation could be based on somebody putting you in water and bringing you back up. But that's what Jesus said. Born again by water and the Spirit. He gave the Great Commission to the apostles. Go teach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. To so many it seems so silly, but it's not any sillier than dipping 7 times in the Jordan to have your leprosy removed. And I wonder, why did God put that story about Naaman in the Scriptures? I think it's the same reason why Paul wrote in Romans 15 that we through patience and perseverance in the Scriptures might have hope. Okay, he meant that. It was simple. There's so many other things there that we can read that are just so simple and so clear that if we just do them, they would work. They would work. One last one. This is from the 8th Psalm. There were several others, but I've used up too much time tonight. So the 8th Psalm, let's go to this one and finish up this lesson. Anybody heard of Matthew Mowry? Matthew Mowry, he was the originator. He started the science of oceanography. He lived back in the 1800s. He was a ship's captain, had a debilitating injury to one of his legs, and so that knocked him out of going to sea. But when he was sick at one point, and I've heard 2 stories, one was the cabin boy, the other one was his daughter, but somebody was reading to him, by his request, the Bible. And the passage they read to him being a seaman, was the 8th Psalm. And this is the part they read. Start reading in Psalm 8, verse 3. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you've made him a little lower than God. You crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands, and you've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas. When Matthew Mowry heard the last part of verse 8, it's like a little light came on. He said, there are paths in the sea according to the Bible. And he started researching the notes of sea captains, and he compiled thousands of notes from hundreds of ships that had been traversing the globe, because they would keep meticulous notes of sea currents and winds and those kinds of things. And he discovered, just like the scriptures say, that there are paths in the sea. People didn't know this before this time. They didn't know that whales migrated, and so the whalers would just go out and look for whales anywhere. But when they found out that whales migrated, they knew, oh, we can go along the migration route and be a lot more successful. How did he know about that? He heard it in the Bible. Why is this a treasure? The reason this is a treasure to me is because it tells me there isn't anything in the Bible that's filler. When God makes a statement in Scripture, it's there for a purpose. When you think about how large the Bible could be, probably if you're like me, you think of the Bible, oh, it's a big book. No, it's really small based on what God could have put in there. But what He did put in there has meaning. Every word, as Jesus put it, every jot, every tittle. Actually, that's King James. He was talking about the smallest letter and the smallest stroke of a letter. What did He say would happen with it? He said it would all be fulfilled. In other words, there's no part of the Bible that's just in there for filler. Oh, it's just fluff. It's just in there to take up space. Everything in here has meaning. Just because you and I may not understand it at the time doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning. I used to look at the genealogies of Jesus and thought, oh, what's this in here for? I can't even pronounce these names. Why does He tell us this guy begat that guy and begat that guy and begat that guy? Well, that's because I was raised in a Gentile home. If I'd been raised in a Jewish home, I'd know exactly what those genealogies were about. And I'd know that they proved that Jesus was, in fact, the one who fulfilled all the prophecies about Him being the Son of David. There's nothing in this Bible that doesn't count. And so when you give yourself over to the study of the Word, you can know that what you're reading has meaning. And just because you may not know what it means at the time doesn't mean it's not valuable. It's not got some good stuff. Well, there's just a few things that I consider treasures out of the Scripture. If I was to take a piece of paper and start it up here and send it back and just say, everybody write down one thing out of the Old Testament you think is a treasure, can you imagine the list that we would get with all these Bible students in here tonight? Wouldn't that be a great conversation starter? Maybe this week while we're sitting around the table at Thanksgiving. Now we'll probably talk about football. Okay. Anyway, well, that's tonight's lesson. The greatest treasure of all, of course, for you and me, is the Son of God Himself, who gave Himself that through Him we might have life. He gave up His life to give us life. He broke down the partition between the Holy of Holies, tore down the veil that separated the place where we knew God was, quote unquote, from the regular Joe like you and me. And He opened that way through His own flesh. And He invites us to take part in the salvation that He brings. If you need that tonight, we'd like to take your confession of Christ and baptize you into Christ. But if you simply need the prayers of this congregation, we want to pray for you as well. We just ask that you come forward and let us know how we can help you while we sing the invitation song together.